Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I think we're at week 9 of our going through the IFS parts work questions and beyond. For those of you who were here earlier, it was just IFS-ish questions, but we realized we're going well beyond that. So we're changing the name to that. So let's do a quick review of how we got where we are now, which is witnessing. We're going to dive into that, hopefully. And we got there by reviewing how to name and identify parts. Step 1, make this a little bit bigger. Unblending and nurturing self to parts relating is the next major thing you do. And then if necessary, in my opinion, you do some contacting with the protector parts. Green is protector parts. And now we're moving into working with exiles. So as we scroll down the table to get to that section, I do want to say that I think a lot of models deal with this. A lot of models deal with working with quote unquote exiles. So what is an exile? You know, if you've gotten this far in this series, then you should have listened to what I said in the first video and read about IFS. So you should understand fires, managers, and exiles. And just to flesh that out a little bit more from my perspective, in conscious heart integration, I've talked about how I see that the respective parts, firefighters, managers, exiles, tend to come from certain channels of our being. And I call them bodies. Arnold Mindell calls them channels. And exiles fundamentally are born mostly out of the emotional body. And we can probably exile other types of parts or other channels. But generally speaking, most people don't feel very comfortable or as comfortable with the emotional channel than they do the mental channel. And I'll just speak a little bit to this because I think it's so helpful. The way Arnold Mindell talks about this in process work. And just a quick aside, hopefully by the time you're watching this, I've made a video about how to get started with IFS and including models that aren't even IFS. That aren't even IFS. Process work by Arnold Mindell is definitely one of them. His background is in Jungian psychotherapy and Gestalt. So he does parts work. And his wife, Amy Mindell, created a series of videos that you can find on, I think, her YouTube channel, if not his, that are animated and are maybe a little bit they're a little hard to follow in some ways, but the actual information I think is really fantastic. And if you can make your way through them, I think it gives a good overview of a lot of his main principles. And I've read Working with Yourself Alone. So I recommend that one. It was fantastic. And I'm about a third of the way through the book he did on shamanism. He absolutely is a transpersonal, or was a transpersonal type of clinician, given, I think, his Jungian background, if not other things. Gestalt is also, I feel, a transpersonal model, given its focus on the here and now, which is its own transpersonal practice and experience. But that's a sidebar. Anyways, all that said, I love the way he talks about channels, because one of the things he identifies is that, say, for example, you're with someone and they seem a little bit like rigid or edgy. And then you're with another person and they seem very fluid. The way he describes why the rigid person becomes rigid or presents as rigid and the fluid person becomes fluid is tied to these channels and how comfortable people are in moving from channel to channel. So essentially the way I understand it is the rigid person, he would say, comes across that way it's because when they start to say, let's just say, for example, because this is what's, I think, most common, you have someone who's very comfortable in the mental channel and they've avoided, for, let's just say, trauma reasons, their emotional channel, because there's just so much energy there. And over time, in the moment they may be dissociated just out of necessity support they needed. And that's a quick, I wish I remembered who I learned this from, but this person was explaining how trauma isn't caused by the trauma. Trauma is caused by how the society responds to the person. And if people are actually very, very, very resilient, and if the community responds well, there isn't trauma. Um, People heal, people recover, and you don't end up with, let's say, PTSD. Um, so that said, let's say somebody had something intense happen in the moment, they dissociated in whatever way just to make it through. They went into dorsal vagal shutdown, collapse, dissociation. Um, Afterwards, they didn't quite get the support they would need to fully integrate that experience. Um, and so then, in some ways, they maybe stayed somewhat dissociated about thinking. Uh, Even just thinking a thought is somewhat dissociative. And right now, talking for me is somewhat dissociating. But if I, shut my pie hole, it's much easier to be more in my body, in my physical, me to come out of that channel and be more in a somewhat mental channel. Same thing happens when we're thinking, when we're daydreaming or spinning out in thought. That in essence is a subtle-ish form of dissociation. All that said, let's say back to our example, you've got someone have a lot of energy in their physical channel, their emotional body, more comfortable and familiar with being in a mental channel. That person, and in part no fault of their own, there's so much energy, let's say there's so much energy in the emotional channel, not pleasant energy, that when they tap into it or start to feel it, or it starts to get a bit stronger, they very quickly might jump back into the mental channel. And this is essentially one way of talking about defense mechanisms. When I think about Freudian defense mechanisms, let's say, or the Gestalt, like the most classic defense mechanisms, like retroflexion, deflection, even confluence, all of them, in my understanding, avoid pain and or to a particular channel. So the rigid person, and not having, let's just say there's just so much there. So innocently, there's just a lot there. So they're innocent in that their reaction is understandable. When they start to feel it, they very quickly come out of it. And that, and over again can come across like someone who's really rigid versus someone who either the emotional channel has so much energy and or they've done a lot of work with it, or they're used to it, or they have a history of knowing that they can tolerate it. And the kind of the core of IFS, which is just the most beautiful, one of the most beautiful parts of IFS, they relate to it without judgment. And I've already gone over that quite a bit, that these feelings are most unpleasant when we are resisting them. So let's just say, for whatever reason, they're comfortable shifting into the channel and they can stay with what Arnold Mindell would call their edge, whatever that edge might be for them, but they can hang out there, even if it's just for a little bit before they maybe transition into another channel. And that would be someone who would present as more fluid. And fluidity is one of the goals. As I understand it, I'm really just getting started in learning more and more about process work. It's such a wonderful complement, I think, to IFS, as is Gestalt, as is focusing, as is a lot of models. But my newest one, personally, is process work. And so I lost my train of thought. So let's tie it back to witnessing and exiles. So exiles, in essence, we'll just say it's any channel that the person tends to rigidly avoid. So all that said, I like that framing because I think it keeps it very neutral. I think clients can easily understand it, and it can neutralize any shame they might have about, oh, why I can't feel my feelings. And it just turns it into a type of physics where you're in one channel, you're not. So all that said, what is witnessing? Witnessing, essentially, after we have identified protective parts and who we might want to witness, and IFS talks about the target part, and we're able to contract and unblend and or unblend from the protector parts, and then we use, for me, it's such a core question of IFS, how do you feel towards the part? And we want to make sure that when we're dealing with the channel, with the part, with an exile, with the trauma, with an intense unresolved memory, that the relationship to it is self-led, at least with, you'd say, curiosity. I would argue neutrality is good enough almost always, as like a bare minimum. And so once that is established, the moment that's established, now we've set the stage to be able to witness. And I think the power of witnessing, like, so let's compare IFS for a moment to just good old-fashioned talk therapy. This in essence is the core of a lot of talk therapy, where folks who say, I don't think I know any therapist who only does this kind of talk therapy, say Rogerian, but I'm sure they're out there. But their intention is to be deeply present, deeply listen, deeply be willing to fully understand their client. And essentially, that's the core of the modality. Just that done well, with some of the pieces we've touched on from Gestalt, like actually making contact, and then weaving in, I would argue, some transpersonal elements of people are whole on some level. It doesn't even have to be transpersonal. We can have a very humanistic, humanitarian lens to relate to people with value, and or that they're capable of healing. And that can also be just based in just basic biology. Healing happens all the time in nature. Nature self-organizes, nature self-regulates, and self-renews. But that kind of witnessing and relationship, I think at the core of it, Neil Donald Walsh talks about how everybody wants to be understood. At the end of the day, whatever interaction you're having with whatever person, if you keep that in mind, that this other person really, really, really wants to be understood, is such a core, deep need to be seen accurately. And that, of course, ties into all sorts of transpersonal pieces around existentialism, discovering for yourself, like, who am I? Who am I really? Arguably from a more kind of, I'll call it new thought perspective, like new age perspective. We're all here trying to rediscover who we actually are on the absolute level. This can be such a sacred process. And I do think the right kind of attention is a type of sacred gift and offering. In essence, it's what we're doing as psychotherapists. It's one piece of it. So all that said, this always obviously applies to parts. Parts want to be seen accurately. Now, in doing this work for so many years, I think I've alluded to, as I've started to classify it as these four main channels or bodies that we have, and then weaving in nonviolent communication over and over and over, became very apparent that the emotional body, i.e., a certain layer of the id, really wants validation. It's the core need that comes up over and over again. And what's beautiful is that when that level of our being it needs, it seems to then open up more ability and natural capacity around just simply being loving. It's just what I've seen over and over and over. So I kind of, with exiles in the emotional body of, you meet the need for acceptance, validation, and I have a series like that for managers. I'll review that for next time. I can maybe just go over it. But the important thing, the absolute key when you're working with exiles, and or the emotional body is validation, and witnessing is just the first step of it. I've quoted it before to memorize it. There's the quote from Henry Longfellow that Dick loves. It's something along the lines of, when you learn your enemy's secret history, you can't but forgive him. And I went into it before, so I won't expand on that. There's a number of things we could say about forgiveness. It's a bit more complex than just that. Absolutely be a component. So all that said, witnessing, identifying parts. So this piece here, and we're just getting started with the exiles contract. Okay, so we covered contracting with exiles last time, and then prior we covered contracting. So we've done all of that. Everyone's good. How do you feel toward? I feel compassion towards it. Like we've talked about earlier, your next step would almost always be send it that compassion and notice how it responds. Always, always, you can err on the side of sending a self-led quality and then done that. And then, so this question, start with this, but it is an absolutely helpful question in terms of clearing up the channel. And then we've touched on this when we talked about exiles in this, or protective parts in the 6Fs. But does this part know how old you are? I would hold off on this kind of question in the beginning until, and maybe if things start to stall out. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, how do you feel towards the sad part? I feel compassion. Send it the compassion. How does the part respond? Well, it's telling me to go fly a kite. That's interesting. What that tells us, if there isn't a positive response, and by positive, I mean they were able to receive it, they were touched by it, it was helpful or healing in some way. And this, what I'm about to expand on, is connected to the idea in IFS that self heals. So there's a self-to-part relationship more times than not if what you did has a healing effect. If what you're doing or what the client's doing isn't having a healing effect, at minimum, nothing changes, or it might actually make things most likely somewhere in the mix. In this example I'm laying out, the client might genuinely feel compassion towards the part, but there's something getting in the way in the middle. And so, and as far as the client's concerned, may not be aware of what that is at all. For them, their genuine experiences, oh my gosh, my heart is just so open and tender towards this sweet little 5-year-old part. And I'm sending it my compassion. But for some reason, this part's saying go fly a kite. So asking, does this part know how old you are, can help flesh out who might be in. This is what I've named, I've talked about it, the babysitters, which tend to be firefighter parts. So say, for example's sake, we got this 5-year-old sad part. And as this kid grew up, eventually when, say, this kid was 12, first video game console. And then he started playing a lot of video games. And then this wasn't as present because he's distracted by video games. And he realized he really, really, really loves video games. So now he's gaming time. And to the point where it becomes a pretty core part of this person's identity. And so if say that was the case, when we asked the 5-year-old, how old, does this part know how old you are? So you get kind of a yes or no for that. And I'm going to take this in a different direction than what we have written here. And then come back to what's on the ask the part. Might very well say, well, you're 12. Or the part might say, well, the part thinks you are, just. And so clarifying who might be in the middle, this would be, now we're back to unblending and identifying parts, which is fine. It might happen throughout the time that you're working with exiles. you circle back to that because more parts show up. So then it's a pretty simple process. You let the 12-year-old see that the keep doing kind of Russian doll dynamics. How old does a 12-year-old think you are? Oh, well, you're 18. Oh, interesting. How's the 18-year-old think you are? And I wouldn't do it that quick. I would spend a little bit of time with each one in the spirit of the 6Fs, and work with them. And what most of the time, if I get to even one other protector part or firefighter, I'll try to cap it there most of the time because that's plenty to work with. And just let both of them know that the present client update the age. And so are these parts open to finding out your current age? And if they say yes, you let them know gently, phrase it. So gently let them know how old you are and how do the parts respond. Usually the parts are very, very relieved. If they're not, then there's probably another part. And then you would want to default to, well, how old does this part think you are? And or would this part like to know how old you actually are? Well, no, we just did that. And then if you still get a negative response, then there's just some other part in the way most of the time. And I think we'll get to this. And so that's the other kind of main channel clearing I like to ask. Age is one and trust is the other. Those are the two main ones you want to remember. If you're working with either protector parts or exiles and it stalls out or they're acting kind of edgy or distrustful, do they know your age and do they feel like they can trust you? So we'll get to the trust piece. It's pretty simple, but since I'm naming it, I'll just also name it here so it's all in one place. Trust is very simple. If you get any kind of weirdness or anything that's kind of non-relational, you can simply ask, does this part feel like it can trust you? And yes or no. And then if it says no, you follow up with, what does this part need from you so that it can feel more trust? And it'll almost always say something like, I need you to actually listen to me. Can you let the part know you're actually going to listen? And or right now, actually listen. Like go into a deep listening state with this part and notice how it responds. And then it notices that the trust gets a bit better. And you can simply repeat that question over and over again. Is there anything else the part needs so that it feels like it can trust you more? Again, it'll say something you can do right there and then, so you go for it. Okay, so I think that's good for this section. So let's keep going. So identifying parts, unblending. So now we're back to a little bit of unblending. Okay, this I just covered. So how old does a part think you are? And then you notice if there's anything other than the client's current age, the part says, well, you're 12. Well, was there anything significant going on at that age? Yeah, I got my first video game console and I was playing video game, or I started smoking pot, or oftentimes there's an addiction at that age because it's at an age where the person simply had more access to something to cope. And so then how do you feel towards that part, the babysitter, let's call them? After self-to-part relationship is established, so that, oh, I feel compassion for that 12-year-old who just wasn't maybe supervised well enough and got so lost in video games. So let this intermediary part know that it no longer needs to take care of the initially contacted part, this younger 5-year-old. How does this feel? How does it feel for these parts to be taken care of now? Implied by the client. Again, usually there's a lot of relief. 12-year-olds don't want to be stuck parenting, essentially, really distressed or hurt or shamed younger parts. They don't know how to do it. All right, so if there's time to be even more thorough, the intermediary part can be asked, how old does this part think you are?
Right.
Yes.
I am noticing that this is going on with it's been like this for a while now.
It's been frozen?
Not frozen. It's like, it's very blurry, and I've gone to multiple other channels and they're not that way.
Got it.
So,
Okay.
I don't know if you need to refresh something or
I don't think I should, because I think it'll disconnect things. It's possible that.
I'm taking notes, so if you have to re-record it or something.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's probably recording fine, is my guess.
Doesn't look like it.
No?
It's very
Okay.
blurry.
All right, so maybe we have to redo this one, and that's fine if we do. Plug in my computer just in case, but it doesn't seem like it's a power issue either.
And I have a question about this, what you're talking about, when you're ready.
Great. Let me finish this one box, and then we can do the questions. Okay, sorry about the interruption. So if there's time to be even more thorough, how old does this part think you are? If the age is anything other than the client's current age, you have discovered another part, repeat the above steps, and you repeat this process until the parts reach the client's current age. If you want, if it feels helpful. I think I've only done that, like, I know at least one time, but maybe a couple of times, if not a handful of times. It's not super necessary. Really, you want to do this, you only have to do this until you get to a point where there is self to part connection, registering with the exile, with the target part, with the emotional body piece, the channel that has been avoided and is holding the emotional energy. As long as there's a healing exchange happening, it's good enough for the most part. And then if there are other parts that need attention, they will, bless you, they will show up another time or in some other ways. Let me see if there's anything else I want to add before we go to the question. No, I think it's good. Yes. So,
Okay.
Question?
So my question is,
yes.
If you discovered that there's a firefighter in there,
yes,
it's the second firefighter. So they had a 12-year-old firefighter that basically would take over and do emotional eating. And then at age 21, it's a positive fire. Like they discover self-development and they're like, oh, I can study all these things. This is amazing. I can completely engulf myself in curiosity and learning and blah, blah, blah. Is that still a firefighter, even though it's a positive firefighter?
It can be. I think what you're naming is potentially that it's like a socially valued behavior.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like a positive firefighter.
Right.
I love to work all the time. Actually, at Castlewood, one of the clinical supervisors, when I talked about this, it was really obvious. She was like, "Oh, good, that's great. We'll take advantage of that."
Oh.
That was the attitude. Yeah, it's not sustainable. I don't know. It's been sustainable for me, but yeah, no. It's the bottom line is that it might still be problematic.
So a firefighter is normally only something that's problematic?
For me, a firefighter is any addiction. So anything kind of rigidly take you out of a channel of pain and tenderness or love, something more vulnerable in the emotional body. And it tends to be, for me, the firefighters are more physical body manifestations. So addictions, but also fight, flight, freeze responses. Okay. These kind of agitated, edgy, but it could also be fear, collapse, like all of that's kind of firefighter-esque. And it's essentially a way to avoid the pain of our humanity. Like there's ventral vagal pain, which is different than sympathetic activation, anger, fear, or dorsal vagal shutdown, numbness. It gets misdiagnosed as depression, but it's essentially collapse and shutdown. It's a trauma response. And so we go into those extreme states, and it just brings us further and further away from our humanity, from our self-leadership, from our heart, from our emotional body. But in our heart and our emotional body is the capacity to feel pain and love, sadness, grief. Grief is essentially when the love is just going to come through whether you like it or not. Like uncontrollable grief. Somebody, let's say, dies and you feel all this grief. What is the grief? The grief is your love for that person saying, whether you like it or not, we are going to fuse into who you are. We're going to fuse into your experience. I think it's Francis Weller. He talks about love being, or he quotes this person. renames love or grief as being love that has nowhere to go. All of that is ventral vagal. All of that is self-led. And all of that could be a channel that's too overwhelming or too painful. And so we can react to it with all sorts of agitation, anger, fear, or just full on dissociation.
Yeah.
So all that said, like say you're working with point where now you're just working with this really extreme, and this is the way I work with all addictions. You could have the client play around with, if you imagine not learning anything new for say a week, and you pick a time period that would be a bit of a stretch, what do you notice? What do you feel? And more times than not, the person will start pushed away by the, is how IFS talks about addictions, is that they essentially distract you away from the exile. But the easiest way to, one of the easiest ways to assess the exile or the emotional body is just to and abstain from whatever the addiction is. And then boom, now you have the trailhead for the target part of what needs to be worked with. But at that point, you then probably have to negotiate a bit with the protective parts that have been pushing it away. The managers are more preventative, where they try to have certain roles to make sure we never feel that again in the future. And the difference between managers and firefighters, one main difference is firefighters are not preventative. Firefighters are, it's a crisis right now. What the manager's trying to do isn't working. We don't care what we have to do. We are putting out this fire with the fight, flight, freeze response, or where's my cigarette? Where's the next course I can sign up for and learn more? Because I don't want to feel this discomfort. And firefighters don't care about the ramifications, where managers do. Managers are more kind of preemptive, and firefighters are more reactive.
That's so helpful.
And just to tie it a little bit to the four bodies, manager parts are more mental body, like that's a more mental channel, generally speaking.
Say that again.
For me, managers are more mental based, the mental body channel, more thinking based, and or beliefs, but that's, I think, even a different channel. I call that the intellectual body, and IFS doesn't really touch on that.
Yeah.
Maybe they would say that's self. And then firefighters are more physical body channel. And so processes and techniques like somatic experiencing, sensory motor, they get more into kind of nervous system activation, like fight, flight, freeze, and just physical stress and defense completions that the body wanted to do but couldn't do, which, you know, interestingly enough, that stuff gets exiled in a way. But in the moment, that's what the firefighter wanted to do in the moment, just to protect itself. But it ends up it gets exiled. So in a sense, firefighters are kind of quasi-exiled because they're not socially appropriate, and or the person doesn't want to be doing these things in a unhelpful way, like in an, and that's where you end up with like a Cartman drama where say, gosh, what would it be? There's a couple different ways you could organize it, but you have the exile. So let's say that's the victim in a sense, and then the manager is the kind of the perpetrator. And okay, we're not going to feel sad. That's not a good feeling. Instead, we're going to be a workaholic, or we're just going to keep learning. So eventually we can be enough, and then we don't have to feel sad, which is kind of offensive or kind of an offender relationship. So the manager would be the kind of the firefighter, could be seen as like a rescuer, like the hero that comes in and says, "Oh, it's okay, sadness. Here, have play some video games. I'll protect you from this, you know, workaholic, inner critic driven perfectionism, and give you a bit of a break." But the problem with that is the manager doesn't see it that way. The manager is going to see the firefighter as the perpetrator because the manager is going to have judgments about playing too many video games. So it comes in, and now it's the perpetrator against who was the hero before, but it views it as the perpetrator, and it's ironically trying to now rescue the whole system, really, or the exile from doing this thing that it thinks is bad. But ironically, what that does is it just adds more shame, which then isn't comfortable and gets exiled, and or it's the exiles in the emotional body, the sensitive parts, that would feel the shame.
That's so awesome.
Well, good. I'm glad it's helpful. This is some of the information I assume you all watching this would have because you've read a book on IFS and but it's great to review and just to give a little bit of context for this. You know what we're going over now. So good question. Yeah. Any other questions on that? Good. Okay. All right. So this is from this one must be from Dick. So let this part show you where it is stuck in the past. So you've got it all cleared up. You send it compassion. It can feel it. You've maybe updated the age if you feel like you need to. And you don't always have to do this. Like if there's just compassion or neutrality and the part's good with it, then you could ask, let this part show you where it is stuck in the past. This is a version of what I believe CBT calls an affect. I've talked about this before. Stephen Hayes, the brilliant quote from his teaching of ACT, people have more compassion for children than they do for who they see in the mirror. And so because of that, he's got his own affect bridges. Stephen Hayes, I remember, and IFS therapist says kind of stuff all the time. How far back does this go? You know, what's the earliest time you remember feeling this way? I think this question is much more IFS-y in that you're giving the part agency to just show you more about it. With being a little bit less direct around that they're going back to an earlier time. This is a little bit cleaner. I don't think I ever asked this, but I like it. I like it now that I'm looking at it. It's a good review. And here's the other one. So this is what I hear Stephen Hayes say a lot. How far back did it start feeling this way? Another one, I should add it if we don't get to it, but can it show you how it got to feeling this way? I wonder if I can I'll just add it here and fix it later. Can this part show you how it got to feeling this way? And that, I believe, is something I came up with. Earlier in the other video, I came across a number 8 reference, and I'm like, I wonder who said that. And it turned out it was me. Some of this is actually original, believe it or not. So I'm pretty sure this is just something I came to, but I probably heard someone else say it, but I don't remember who it was. Affect bridges, and what this does, so it does the Stephen Hayes piece. You definitely have more compassion for children, and it helps you clarify who you're actually talking to. Obviously, it takes you to the sponsoring event. So let's talk a little bit about like how young do we need to go? Ideally, you want to go to the earliest time, the first time, the sponsoring event. When people can work with those memories, in my experience, it tends to be the fastest way to work it through. And I'll give you a sometimes, in my experience, people have certain fears, phobias, like trauma, like PTSD responses that they don't remember when they started feeling this way, and it's as far back as they can remember. When people use that kind of languaging, well, it's as far back as I can remember. I've always felt this way. I've always been afraid of water. That potentially is a clue that it could be related to a past life, believe it or not. I've done so much of these sessions. You don't have to believe it. Just think again, cultural competence, like be open to it. I mean, obviously, if the client's like, "Oh, I just have a sense it's a past life," then you want to roll with that. But I'm a transpersonal counselor, so I do feel it's important for me to check out, are you open to the possibility of this being a past life? Most people are open to it. Even agnostic folks are oftentimes just open to asking the question. And then when they ask if it is, they get the sponsoring event, which is from a past life. And again, if they can tie it back to that, it processes a lot more quickly than, say, the client who responds with, no, I get that you graduated from Naropa, but no, thank you. Okay, fine, not a problem. And I did have a client once who had that response and was getting a vision of getting stabbed by a knight with a sword in their chest. They could feel the pain, kind of getting the sponsoring event. But let's just say, for example's sake, they weren't getting the sponsoring event. The good news is it doesn't matter. The important element of the memory is the implicit memory. If people can just stay self-relating to whatever the sensation or feeling is, eventually it will process. The thing is if they actually caused it, their mind of it, and that is a very important part of trauma healing. I just kind of arguably dissed a bit on thinking it's dissociative, and some folks get almost anti-CBT, which is ridiculous, but they're all about, we got to be in our body and feel the feelings. Teal Swan had a really wonderful video when COVID happened around working with trauma, and she laid it out so beautifully. Essentially, that part of healing trauma is that at a certain point, you're going to need to make meaning out of it all. The problem is that when the meaning-making parts, and for me, this is the intellectual body, Freud would call it the superego, we're constantly wanting to make meaning out of things. This channel wants things to make sense. We want to understand other people, but that's just a very natural quality, and that's where curiosity, I would argue, comes from, the self-led quality of curiosity. Just a quick aside, we'll get to it when we get to it, but the four bodies, I also have mapped out that it just happens to be symmetrical, that two self-led qualities match up with each body. So that in essence, you could think of parts as actually being aspects of self, and when they're healed, the parts are able to express those self-led qualities. So for the intellectual body, that's where curiosity tends to come from. And I have it all mapped out. We'll get to that another time. So anyways, all that said, the tricky part with these intellectual parts, or these parts that just want to have a story for it, is that it's good, but the timing is really important. So when these parts come in prematurely, they tend to come up with stories that then we use CBT to clear out, that are simply inaccurate. Why? Because they don't have all the information. So a common example is, this happened with my parents when I was young, and therefore I must be bad. I'm a bad boy. It's just a very limited perspective at that age. Didn't know probably a lot of things that would have helped make very different meaning out of it if they knew certain things about their parents. And so you have the meaning maker just to get a sense of control. Will just make up some. It's a total fantasy, like a negative fantasy. It's a lie. It's a delusion, essentially. It can help create kind of a delusional trance state when we have a lot of stories that are just false. And so these parts will come in at times while you're doing this work, and well, we must be bad. And what you want to ask those parts to do, let me tell you how it typically happens. These intellectual parts, these meaning-making parts, tend to be skeptical to cynical. And so they'll come in and have stories like, it doesn't help. We'll always feel this. and they have always felt this way. And so, and could you hold off? Like, we get it. That's how it's been. After we witness more information, so we can make even clearer meaning. That's essentially the intervention with those kinds of protector parts. When they creep in, you're just asking them to wait, essentially. So all that said, all of that was just kind of highlight why it is ideal and important. If you can get the accurate context, the actual sponsoring event, that is ideal. And things absolutely can still process even when the client has no idea why they might have certain sensations or feelings. I've seen that over and over and over again. The main rub is that it just takes a bit longer. But it's absolutely possible. Okay, so affect bridges. Let's keep going. All right, so another witnessing piece here. If you or the client suspect the memory was not the sponsoring event and or early events store significant emotional energy, so was there anyone else who made this part feel similarly? That's interesting. I have no idea where that is from. I know that if needed, repeat until the client reaches the earliest sponsoring event. Who before that? Oh, interesting. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, so let's say, for example, you got a part, the part feels sad. I wonder if this is from the workbook. I don't remember where this is from. And the part's not sure when it felt sad. So you could ask, was there anyone who made the part feel something along these lines? And that might bring them to a memory. I think the reason why I'm not familiar with this question is because I haven't had the need to use anything like this. I wonder if this is from the workbook. I'll look that up. I'll research that. Usually the sadness, you know what? Actually, sometimes that can happen where they're like, yeah, I just feel this way. I'm not sure how. Yeah, I guess I've just never thought to ask this. So yeah, you can play around with it. Maybe I will too, and come back and report later. And so then the next piece of this is kind of in the spirit of getting to the earliest one possible. If needed, repeat until the client reaches the earliest or sponsoring event. Like, so who contributed to the client feeling this way? Not the feelings show or the parts show the client what memory it's connected to or what person it's connected to. All right, another witnessing question. How can it show you the earliest time? Can it show you the earliest time it felt this way? Okay, we covered that. Let it show you how it got to feeling this way. I believe we covered that one. What does this part want you to know about itself? I love that question. I ask that all the time. Very open-ended. Is there a specific incident it needs to show you? It's an okay question. I don't know that I've ever had to use that, but not a bad question. It's kind of like 6 FEs towards the exile in a sense. You're getting to know it, befriend it, showing interest. Can this part tell you or show you more? That's a nice one. Like if you have a sense, there's just more there. The way I tend to ask this question is just see if there's more this part needs you to know. And I might add in, if I haven't already named it, how it got to feeling this way. But usually I lead with that, and then it can just get pared down to see if there's more this part wants you to understand. Okay, ask the part if that's true, fits. Okay, this is important. So let's say the client gets something and they're not quite sure. The good news is you can always just ask the part. This is, I think, so important to remember. Don't have to figure it out. Don't have to second guess. Simply ask. And or the client might assume something, because you can tell, especially the more you do this work, whether responses come from the inside out and it's kind of apart, or that they're thinking about it. And they'll use languaging like, well, I think that da 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 da. So try to catch that as much as you can and redirect it. You say, oh, that's interesting. You know, it sounds like there's a part of you that thinks this, or you think this, but could you just check it out with the part and see what the part has to say about that? And people will present a little bit differently when they're like actually listening and waiting and trusting that something will come to them, and then it does come to them. A good sign that the client is in that kind of receptive mode is that they're genuinely surprised by what comes up. One of my favorite moments in sessions is when clients say, oh my gosh, this is going to sound nuts. Like they're genuinely shocked. They assume you might even judge it. And I get really excited because I know they're not trying to control it. And I know like intellectual parts are not trying to figure it out or analyze it. So that's always great. But let's just say for example's sake, in terms of this question, client is saying, yeah, I think that this part probably da 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 da. You can just roll with it and say, oh, okay, that's interesting. I want you to just ask the part if that fits. I want you to ask the part if that's true. And then like, oh yeah, yeah. And then they tune in and they listen and they hopefully get a response. All right, moving right along. Next witnessing piece. What does this part need you to know / understand? Okay, so that's one we use a lot. Okay, now this gets important. So next section in witnessing, does that make sense to you? Or is what this part feels, had been feeling, makes sense? Let it know that you get it all the time. This is really, really, really important. This is one of the main things that Dick is going for, that he wants the witnessing to get to a point where the part deeply understood, deeply enough understood. And I think I've talked about this, but I'm going to mention it again because it's such a nice example of this. Harville Hendricks in the couples therapy model, you may remember me talking about how one of the main strategies they use is that they have one partner share and share and share and share, and the other their only cue is there more? Oh, is there more? And what they're going for is an eventual aha for the listener, where the listener like really, really gets it. Kind of like the Longfellow quote that I mentioned earlier. Once you understand your partner's secret history, you can't help but fall back in love with them. So I ask this quite a bit, like especially if something feels significant, but you do want to weave this in at least a few times. Why? Because we're going to get to it. You want the understanding to be set, and you want the part to be fully gotten before you get to retrieval. So that's one reason why this is so important. In addition to what I said earlier, everybody wants to be understood and seen for who they truly are. Okay, so let's say the client says, yes, I know, great, I get it. Say, okay, let it know you get it. And or send it your understanding. You let it know you understand. And how does it respond? Notice how it responds, capturing the impact. So helpful to do. All right. And if we don't get it, like if it doesn't make sense to you and the client's like, nope, I don't really get it. Or do you understand? Does this part make more sense? No. Okay, great. Ask it to tell you more. Or what else does it want you to get? What else does it want you to understand? Okay. And then this is from Imago. Is there more? We just covered that. Is there more this part wants you to know? Or does it feel like you get it? Like this is it. This is what you're shooting for. This is key. Eventually you want to ask it this explicitly. Does it feel like you get it? And you want to get the yes. You do this until you get the yes. And usually this happens pretty quickly. You know, the client is witnessing, and most of the time the client remembers all this in some ways. It might be like, oh, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but they absolutely get it most of the time. But there are times where it's confusing, they don't quite get it. and or the client might think that they get it because, yeah, I live this, I remember, but it's got kind of a dismissive air to it. And there might be nuances that the exile still wants the person to get. The crux of it oftentimes is really just getting the feeling. Again, emotional body, it's so that's the core of their experience oftentimes of that channel is emotions and feelings. But there could be, some other pieces. The interesting thing is, we're going to jump ahead just a tiny bit, along the lines of do they get it? One of the places where CBT kind of misses the mark is when you just leave, like, oh, what are your core beliefs? And all right, let's challenge those. Not working for you. Sometimes you can't get to the core beliefs until you get to the exiles. Means you've got to clear out the parts in these more, I don't want to call them superficial channels, but the more mental channels, which is where a CBT practitioner might feel really comfortable working in, because if there's the story that, oh, we just everything. But what Freud was really brilliant at is that there is a layer of beliefs that is somewhat pre-conscious, and that would be the superego. When he talked about the superego, he identified that it wasn't, we don't lead with the superego. And then just reflect on this for a moment. Like if I ask you, what's your core belief about something we used to use in understanding, men are blank, women are, people are blank, the world is blank. Like in order to reflect on that, you've got to kind of tune in. You got to turn inwards. You have to reflect. It isn't just, front of mind, top of mind. And so in a sense, that kind of stuff also gets exiled. So the intellectual body also oftentimes is in the background. So all that said, sometimes you can't even get to like the deeper core beliefs until you're working with the emotions, until you're working with the exile, what these parts were dealing with, all this pain and sadness, and then eventually I feel like I'm bad, and it's like, oh my gosh, and then you work with that. Okay, I think, Cherie, any finalish questions? All right, so I'm going to underline this so we can remember where we left off. And thank you for coming back. And I hope this has been helpful and continues. And if you remember, like and subscribe and comment below. It all helps the channel. And it helps us, and it helps. I'm excited when we get to 1,000 folks. There's some link stuff I can do, which I think I've already mentioned. But yes, that helps us out, and hopefully this feels helpful to you. All right, we love you, and bye-bye.